Hello, I'm Dr. Lewis Hoffman of Saybrook University. This brief video lecture is a course introduction to the course Psychology, Religion, and Spirituality in Their Cultural Context, which is offered at Saybrook University. In this brief introduction, I'm going to go through the requirements of the course, but also I'm going to consider some of the important context for this course. So we're going to talk a little bit about the basic relationships between psychology, religion, spirituality, and culture as we'll look at them in this course. I'm going to begin by going over the requirements for the course. First is the syllabus. Please be sure to read the syllabus. This is an important step in setting you up to succeed in the course. It's also your best go-to for questions in the course, to go there first before posing other questions. But of course, if there are any questions about the syllabus or course requirements, please be sure and let me know as well along the way. However, a lot of questions are answered typically just by going back and reviewing the syllabus. Next, there are going to be a number of video lectures for the course for each module, and this course is divided up into different modules that span over a few weeks. And for each of these, there's going to be a video lecture. This is important for supplementing the material and providing some context. One of the challenges is there aren't a lot of resources out there that do look at psychology, religion, spirituality, and culture, all of these and how they interact together. There are resources that deal with aspects of this, but the lectures hopefully will be important ways of helping you to connect some of the dots between those. So please be sure and read those. I want to talk briefly about the three textbooks next. The textbooks were selected very intentionally for this course. The first is Ian Barber, and he talks about when science meets religion and talks about different models. Now, there are other emergent models that could be talked about. This book is a little bit older, but I selected it for a good reason. This really does a nice job at getting in and talking about some of the epistemological and other challenges when looking at pulling psychology and religion together. So this, I think, is a very good foundational text for looking at those, and we'll update some of the other models through our discussion and the lectures as well. Second is a book by Fontana that is more of a traditional psychology of religion and spirituality textbook. It covers a lot of the things that will be covered there, but there are specific ways that Fontana approaches it that I appreciate, which is why this was the textbook I selected of the many different options. And then third is a book by Paul Tillich, The Dynamics of Faith. This is a short little book that I think is very helpful in a number of ways. There are some ways that we'll talk about that it could be updated as well. This is a fairly old book written in the 1950s, but it still is very valuable. Also, I think it's important for this course because Tillich was very influential in the development of existential psychology, which is part of the humanistic tradition that Saybrook falls in. So this is a nice book at touching in some of those aspects of Saybrook's legacy and history and the unique Saybrook perspective when looking at these topics. There are also going to be a number of journal articles from the Saybrook Library that are required. I've historically tried to link some of these up so that you can just click and go right to them. Those links don't always work. They do change over time, and so at times those will be broken. If they are, I've provided information about how to very easily go to the Saybrook Library and look up the articles, so you should be able to find them even if the link is not working. And there are a couple other articles that are available directly in Canvas. That should be Canvas. We used to call it My Learning at Saybrook, but now we use Canvas and just refer to it as that. And these articles there's a chapter that I've gained permission to put in there, as well as a paper that I wrote a number of years ago that is in there. That paper, there's some ways that I would update it from when it was originally written, and we'll talk about that some as we go through the course as well. And then also you will need to do some outside reading for your papers. And this is pretty typical, finding that there are at times students that try to rely just on the course materials for their papers. But the purpose of the assignments really is to show that you can go out into the literature and find relevant resources, find the most current resources, and apply them to what you're trying to develop. That's a very fundamental skill in academia that's important, and is also going to be something that will be important as you work on your thesis or dissertation. So please be sure that you are engaging the literature beyond the course as well. The assignments for the course, one is participation. This is really important for the course to make sure that we're engaged with each other, because each of us can bring different things. We each have our own context that we can bring to this material, and that is a really vital part of the learning, is that engagement with each other, to be able to see it in different ways. So I see this not just as an assignment to fill space, as is sometimes perceived, but rather it is an important part of the content. When you're doing your participation, though, I encourage you to do it in a way where you're playing around and exploring the material. The type of writing for the participation should be different than what you're writing in your papers. In your participation post, I would encourage you to play around with ideas, including things you're not sure if you agree with yourself. But this is a great place to do that, to get feedback, get different perspectives, to explore your ideas in a more free approach. I see this as intending to mimic a classroom discussion, not writing essays. So you don't need to cite an APA style in your participation, and actually I would encourage you not to, because if you're focusing in that way, you're not going to be engaging the material in the same way as if you engage more freely, as if it were in a classroom discussion. So you can just refer to where you're getting the information from. So for example, you might say, Barbara discussed this, but you don't need to cite it. Or I read a paper that discussed this. If you can remember the author, great. If you can't, don't. But the more freedom you use in engaging that participation, the more you're going to get at what I'm really hoping you'll get from that assignment. And then there's 3 required papers. These papers really are intended to fit together and build off of each other. Now, the mistake some people make with trying to do that, though, is cutting in and pasting sections of one paper into the next paper. That I don't want you doing. You might draw on some of the same resources, but hopefully in each paper as you go along, it's also going to expand a little bit. But this is, I think, foundational work that parallels some of the ideas about cultural competency, particularly as applied to religion in some ways as well. What we're going to start off is looking at personal context. So this first paper, it's much more of an informal paper than as compared to the next 2. And what I want you to explore here is, what is your own personal, spiritual, religious, and cultural context, and how those interact. So this is looking at oneself. This is really critical when we work with people from different cultural contexts. If we're not aware of our own context, our own biases, our own influences, we often misunderstand others and may unduly impose our beliefs on others in some contexts as well. So looking at our own context is really important. That's the focus of this first paper. The second paper is looking at models and theories. So in this, what I'm hoping that you'll be doing is starting to develop what is your approach to looking at the psychology, religion, and spirituality in a cultural context. Though it's your approach to doing this, you'll be drawing on models and ideas that are out there, and it should be written as a scholarly paper in a scholarly tone. A lot of people, because it's talking about your model or theory, seem to slip into a style that's not necessarily as much of a scholarly tone. For example, using a lot of phrases such as I think, or I believe, or I would advocate. Well, that's implicit in there. What you're arguing for is your opinion. But you still want to write it in a scholarly way, similar to what you're going to see in a journal article. And then you want to support your ideas with the literature that's out there. When people develop new models and ideas that impact the literature in the broader field, it's not just putting out an idea without engaging previous models, what is different, engaging the literature to support one idea. The best new models and theories are ones that really are deeply engaged with what is out there and written from that perspective. So this is a place for you to do that and really engage with the literature. And then the third paper is going to build off of that and look at the application. You can assume in that third paper that I've read the second and that you're building off of that. How are you going to apply this model to your professional direction? That may be in therapy, consulting, teaching, education, public speaking, research. There can be a lot of different directions that you go with the application. But what I want to see is how are you planning to apply what you talked about in the model theory section. So we're moving from personal context to next talking about one's theory through an engagement with the literature, one's emergent theory, and then how you're going to apply that. So these working together hopefully will put you in a position where you're able to better utilize the content from this course about how you're going to go out and apply it in a culturally sensitive manner. Now last, I want to talk a little bit about some of the foundations of the course. And this course examines the various ways that religion and spirituality interface with psychology with special consideration given to the cultural context. So that has a lot of information in it just right there. But we're looking at how religion and or spirituality interface with psychology. That's a foundation of this. But yet we want to consider the cultural aspects of it. That's what's often missing. So let me give you a couple of examples. Mindfulness is a big craze in the field of psychology right now. It's very popular. And the idea of mindfulness generally is attributed to Buddhism, though some of the psychological perspectives on mindfulness were not intending to draw from Buddhism, just used similar language. So there's some confusion that we get right there. But when you look at mindfulness in a Western context versus mindfulness in Southeast Asia, you're going to find that there's a different context to it. There's a different way of engaging it. When you look at mindfulness within a Buddhist context versus a psychological context, there's going to be some different intents. That there is more of what could be stated as a spiritual intention with mindfulness when it is applied within that Buddhist context, whereas within the psychological context, it's generally applied more with the intention of promoting psychological health and well-being. There's different intentionality with this, and this has changed mindfulness in some ways that I've often had some concern about. Now, another challenge with this is that what is talked about as mindfulness in psychology today, it's often presented as this is something new and revolutionary. Well, it's not. It is something that has been in psychology well before there were significant Buddhist influences that have come in. What often is talked about as mindfulness today is very similar, for example, to some of the things that James Bugenthal did, some of the things Eugene Genlin did. I'm not saying that they're the same thing. I don't intend to reduce them in that way. But a lot of depth psychology approaches did things very similar to what is called mindfulness today. And actually would say some of it is actually basically the same. But where it is basically the same, mindfulness has been pulled a little bit more from its Buddhist origins. So there's a very complex context here when we look at mindfulness and consider the cultural context, the religious spiritual context, and the psychological context. And I think what has been missing here is really problematic. What has been missing in the discussion has really been problematic in a lot of ways because it doesn't honor the differences. I think it has not honored the Buddhist tradition in a lot of ways, in the way that it has been incorporated into psychology. So that's one example of how we would look at the differences. Another that will be talked about some later in this course, based on some research that I did, it looked at people's experience of what they perceived as God. And what we found is that there are some significant cultural differences in how people experience God, but also how people look at some of the terminology. So what the meaning of religion, for example, in the United States often has a very different meaning for people that are, and not just meaning in terms of definition, but also personal meaning, for people that are in privileged dominant culture versus people that are in various cultural groups or marginalized groups. So this is something that really needs to be considered, is how religion is experienced and understood differently. For some, religion is something that is seen as no longer needed. And so we hear the idea of being spiritual but not religious is being a very common position that people hold nowadays. But within some cultural groups, the idea of being spiritual without religious doesn't really make sense to the way that religion is functioned in their lives. So these differences, I think, are very interesting and important differences for us to consider. It's popular in many ways to be critical of religion in our culture today and to idealize spirituality in ways as well, often concurrently. But as we do that, it may not fit with all people's experience, all people's understanding of what these really entail. So we have to be careful in our assumptions about what is religion, about what is spirituality, and particularly with the recognition that the answers to that may have a cultural component to it. When we think about the different units of study, well, one is going to be looking at those definitions. How do we define these? And there's different ways to define them. What I'm going to advocate is there's not one right way to define religion, spirituality, and even psychology. All of these and the definitions are going to be influenced by culture. So that definition is, in some ways, a foundation for these major units of study. And I would say being able to hold on to the definitions loosely, in particular, is a foundation for it. Now, next, we could talk about the psychology of religion and spirituality and contrast this with the integration of psychology with religion and spirituality. Now, this is a significant difference. Psychology of religion and now psychology of religion and spirituality is something that has been popular in the field of psychology and religious studies for quite a few years. But there's an assumption in this by saying psychology of. It puts psychology over. It's a psychological or a scientific study of religion and spirituality. So religion and spirituality are more the objects here. When we talk about the integration of psychology with religion and spirituality, now we're putting these on the same playing field. We're saying that psychology, religion, and spirituality can be integrated with each other. And that one doesn't have an epistemological power over the other, but rather we're putting the epistemologies even on the same plane here. So when we start to do that, that brings up a whole score of other ethical issues. If doing this, for example, in a psychotherapy context, we need to consider that does this lead to the imposition of values or spiritual or religious beliefs upon clients? That's an important consideration. When we have competing epistemologies, how do we deal with that when integrating? That's some of what Barbara's going to be looking at in that first textbook that I referred to. So these are complicated questions. But then we bring in that cultural context, which continues to have implications when we talk about both the integration of psychology with religion and spirituality and the psychology of religion and spirituality. And there's some articles that you'll be reading that will help explicate that as well. So this is what we're going to be covering in this course, is going through this and looking at it in depth. And as you can imagine, by the way that that is set, the content for this course is very, very broad. And you're going to be choosing some specific areas that you may focus in a little bit more. And when you come back and look at these assignments, this allows you to do that. So your personal context may help to narrow what type of models or theories you're interested in, what you're really looking at, what you want to do. And then next, that application is how you're going to apply it. Now, I hope that you get some of that broader context as well, not just focusing on the specific areas that you're looking at, but the broader context of the debates and dialogues and discussions in the field about how psychology, religion, spirituality, and culture all fit together and intersect.